This is when we first met and when we started first dating. And this is the motorcycle that Lauren gave me a ride on. One of the first motorcycle rides that I had ever had. And it was a very exciting, fun thing to do. He was funny. He had a good sense of humor. You know, he was very attractive, quite a bit older than me. And, you know, he kind of swept me off my feet in a lot of ways. But when you start going back and thinking about that time frame and, you know, maybe sharing these pictures with people, it triggers a lot of emotions. It's very hard for me to enjoy a good memory now, looking back through all of the pain that I went through with Lauren. It still makes me very sad that he was such a bad person, because he was such a good person when I met him at first. It was roughly just under a year when Lauren asked me to marry him. I was very young and naive, and I was rebellious, I guess you could say. I was gonna do what I wanted to do, and I did, and I regret it now. We were married April 16th, 1988. Little did I know at the time, Lauren was drinking a lot of whiskey, getting ready for the wedding. And Lauren wound up passing out. And I remember being pissed right away. And I looked over and Lauren was throwing up. Family members had to run over and turn Lauren over so he wouldn't choke to death. And so that was a huge red flag. But I knew that I only wanted to get married once. And I took it very seriously. And I tried my hardest for a very long time. But sometimes things don't work out the way you hope they do. It wasn't very long after we were actually married that I remember one specific time we were living in the apartment in Stockton. And I think it was like midnight, 1 a.m. I remember being on the bed laying down, and Lauren wanted to have sex. And I remember telling him, no, I don't want to. And he got very angry very fast. As soon as I told him no, he grabbed me by the throat. And he looked at me and he said, "Don't ever tell me no." It very much surprised me. You know, because you tell somebody no, and their instant reaction is, oh no, you're gonna do what I want. You're blindsided. You didn't see that coming, and it scares you. I remember I was scared enough that I said to him, I was just playing. I kind of talked my way out of, pissing him off anymore. So yeah, I mean, he forced me to have sex. That was one of the very first times that Lauren was ever angry like that with me. And then from there on, it started to be more often and more frequent. Yeah, it did change how I interacted with him. I was always very careful to hopefully not piss him off. Definitely didn't want to tell him no about anything. Lauren was going to do what he wanted, no matter what I said. When I was pregnant, Lauren continued to stay out late, go, whatever the hell it was he wanted to do. And I realized very early on in my pregnancy that I would be solely responsible for taking care of the baby by myself. One time, Lauren and a friend of his, Wes, were going camping, hunting to the hills for the weekend. Later that day, Wes's wife called me.
Hello?
And said, hey, come over. So I said, yeah, sure, I'll come over and hang out with you. So I went over and I wound up staying the night there. Going home in the morning, the truck was there and I didn't think anything of it other than, oh, he's home, I'll go home, I'm home now. And I remember when I walked in and I walked up, it was dark in the house. The door that I walked into, you walk in and then you would turn and go up a couple steps and there would be the kitchen. And as soon as I stepped into the kitchen, Lauren turned on the overhead light. And I looked over and he was sitting there with the gun on his lap. And just really pissed off look on his face. And it shocked me. And I remember stepping back and he asked me, where were you? You said you weren't going anywhere. And I said, I was over at her house because you guys were up in the hills. And he was just so pissed that I wasn't home. That was one of the first really scary incidences. After we had the argument, he left the house, but he very much wanted to scare me. He made it very known that he was pissed off, and I think the gun on his lap, he was telling me that he would not hesitate to shoot me if he wanted to. Every time there was an incident like that, I got more and more fearful of him and afraid and let him control my life more out of fear. So this picture here is Lauren on another motorcycle that he had, and I want to say it was 1990. The first time Lauren really beat me up. It was late and I was asleep and Lauren called home. And his motorcycle had broken down and he needed me to bring him some tools so he could, try to get it started. I'd gotten dressed and got my purse and gotten the tools and everything, and I sat down on the couch and I wound up falling back asleep. Later that night, I was woken up by Lauren. He was yelling and screaming at me how I was a bitch.
I can't believe you would do that to me!
And he's hitting me and smacking me and, pulling me around by my hair.
Do you know how long I was waiting for you?
But he was holding our child while doing that. Who in the hell holds their child while beating on someone? But when he was done beating me up, he went right to bed. I remember back then feeling very alone and very scared and very heartbroken, just praying that it was over and he wasn't going to be abusive any more that at that time. This photo here, I want to say this was about 1991. If I remember correctly, I was actually a couple months pregnant with our second child. But this picture here is of Lauren and then a cousin of Lauren's. And they have their compound bows. He had a couple of friends that he spent a lot of time with together, especially at West Shermantine. So Lauren and Wes were best friends growing up, and they did a lot of activities together, you know, whether it was riding bikes or going hunting. When there were times that Lauren was out with Wes, sometimes for days on end. For me, it makes me wonder, all those times, there's a good chance that he was out there doing very bad things. I came home from work one day, it was on a Saturday, and I was tired. And I went outside to sit out on the back patio. All of a sudden, to the side of me, maybe about a foot or so from me, an arrow stuck into the ground. The tip on the arrows used for these bows are called broadheads, and those are basically razor blades, very sharp. And of course it scared me, it startled me. And when I looked up, Lauren was up in the tree and he had his bow in his hand. And when I looked at him and looked him in the eye, he actually started to giggle and laugh. He enjoyed that he scared me. It was very intentional. I think it was a reminder that he's in control and I can do whatever I want, when I want, to you. How disgusting and horrible. He could have very well damn missed. It could have went right through me. You're a damn monster to do that to somebody. I would never do that to anybody. There were many, many times that I was just a moment or a second away from Lauren taking my life. I'm very, very lucky that I am still alive today, that I lived through and survived through a lot of those things that Lauren did to me. One time during one of the abusive incidences, he was abusing me, beating me up, and he was throwing me all over. He had me by the hair and dragging me around and choking me. And he hit on me so much that I lost consciousness. And I remember standing up and I was very dizzy and like just kind of out of it. And I remember getting in bed and I thought, well, if I don't wake up in the morning, I don't wake up. And I woke up the next morning and I got into the shower and I was washing my hair and stuff. And I literally counted every knot on my head and I had 15 knots on my head. That was one of the worst times. There's a lot of things that I have a really hard time remembering. And then there's times that things, you know, little stories or memories just come to me that I haven't thought about in a very, very long time. He was just angry all the time. I don't know why, but he was just mad. He was just angry all the time. I don't know why, but he was just mad. I don't know why, but he was just mad. I don't know why, but he was just mad. I don't know why, but he was just mad. I don't know why, but he was just mad. I don't know why, but he was just mad. I don't know why, but he was just mad. I don't know why, but he was just mad. I don't know why, but he was just mad. I don't know why, but he was just mad. I don't know why, but he was just mad. I don't know why, but he was just mad. I don't know why, but he was just mad. I don't know why, but he was just mad. I don't know why, but he was just mad. I don't know why, but he was just mad. I don't know why, but he was just mad. I don't know why, but he was just mad. I don't know why, but he was just mad. I don't know why, but he was just mad. I don't know why, but he was just mad. I don't know why, but he was just mad. I don't know why, but he was just mad. I don't know why, but he was just mad. I don't know why, but he was just mad. I don't know why, but he was just mad. I don't know why, but he was just mad. I don't know why, but he was just mad. I don't know I think that for a very, very long time, there was still hope that there was some little hope in me that he was gonna do the right thing and be the right person and the right husband, and he wasn't. He wasn't. I think very much that once Lauren felt that I wasn't going anywhere, that Lauren can start behaving the way he wanted to and being the person he wanted to be or the person that he really was. Lauren actually always suspected me of cheating or lying and hiding things from him. There was one time the kids were with a family member and Lauren got on one of his rampages.
I know there's something going on between you two.
You're paranoid.
And I remember this one time I said to him, "What do I have to do? Cut off one of my fingers to prove it to you?" And as soon as the words left my mouth, I realized that he was gonna say, "Yeah." And he said, "Yeah, you do." And I remember he even handed me a knife. And I remember I put my hand out like this and I was holding the knife and I was terrified.
Do it!
Because he expected me to do it. He was gonna make me do it. But I was so stupid. Why would I say that to him? Knowing the violence that he was capable of towards me. And I remember I was just kind of like, I was just there. Like I was just trying to make it through those moments, hoping that I wouldn't have to cut my finger off. I'm very lucky that I have all of my fingers. I really don't know how I managed to get out of there with all of my fingers. I've said before, I kind of feel like the silent abuse victim because if I just stayed quiet, then I couldn't give him anything else to get angry about, you know? So I was just quiet. One of the things that me and Lauren used to do, either by ourselves or with friends, is we would go up to the mountains and go camping. One specific time, it was me, Lauren, Wes's girlfriend. Lauren and Wes wound up going off by themselves in a vehicle. And when they came back to camp, I remember them being both a little heated and aggravated and, well, just irritated in general, I guess. I really didn't think anything about it. I just thought it was, you know, something that happened. And probably within an hour or so, the police showed up. When we saw the police pulling up to the campsite, Lauren had a stainless steel .357 revolver. And I remember him hiding it under a big boulder. So when the police came into our campsite, they proceeded to question us all. Where were you? Did you go for a drive, a hike a couple hours ago? Did you have an altercation? Two gentlemen said that someone fired shots at them.
Did any of you leave your campsite today?
They heard firearms and ricocheting bullets.
You didn't get into a fight with someone today?
Lauren and Wes denied it. So when the police left, I do remember Lauren and Wes. There's kind of that sigh of relief, that energy of like, okay, well, it's done. We don't have to worry about it anymore. That was something that should have been a huge red flag to me back then. Knowing now how absolute crazy Wes and Lauren were, he hid that pistol for a reason. Lauren woke me up one morning. He already had made plans prior to go, I believe it was either pheasant or dove hunting with a buddy of his. And I remember saying, why'd you wake me up? And he said, oh, because I'm getting ready to leave soon to go hunting.
I'll make some coffee.
And I remember thinking, that was not a regular, normal thing for Lauren to do. If Lauren had plans to go to work, to go four-wheeling, to go hunting, etc., he would never wake me up in the morning and say, hey, I'm leaving. So I got up out of bed, went into the kitchen to start coffee, and Wes was there. He was sitting in the chair in the kitchen, and I noticed he was biting on his nails. He was nervous, fidgety, anxious. I could tell that he had been up all night and hadn't slept.
You ready?
Yeah.
I mean, at the time, those two things seemed weird to me, you know, but not weird enough to where it was like, okay, what the heck is going on? That's something that I later on put together as him making sure that I could vouch for him being home that morning. But I never had any reason to believe or seen anything specific that would have alerted me to them doing the horrific things that they did together. Looking back now, Lauren was full of crap. And Lauren was a bad person, and Lauren had done some very bad things. So this is a picture of Cindy Vanderheiden. I met her just a couple of times briefly. And from what I understand, Cindy actually really liked Lauren as a friend. I'm glad that it's a picture of Cindy smiling. I'm glad that from this picture, you know, I think that Cindy was a happy person and that she enjoyed life. I wish that she was still here and that she never had to go through that horrible thing that she had to go through, and I wish that she had never lost her life. Lauren and his buddy had left to go bird hunting that morning. And I'm at home with the kids and, you know, just another typical weekend morning. And I was sitting outside on the back patio, and Cindy Vanderheiden's dad stopped by our house and asked if Lauren was home. And of course I said no, he's out with so-and-so, he'll be back later. And Cindy's dad said, okay, can you, I think he said, can you ask him to give me a call?
I just wanted to ask Lauren if he heard anything or seen her.
They haven't been able to get a hold of her, so I think he was probably just out looking, trying to cover all of his bases.
Thanks.
Later on that day, when Lauren and his buddy got back from bird hunting, I told Lauren that her dad had stopped by and asked if Lauren could please give him a call. They're looking for Cindy.
Whatever.
his response, he just kind of, in a sense, like shrugged it off. It never crossed my mind that Lauren could be a part of or responsible for Cindy's disappearance. I really never thought that he would do anything like that or be capable of something like that, especially him and Cindy being friends. Why, he would have no reason to harm her. When the detectives knocked on the door, I was surprised to see detectives there. It's not something that happens every day.
Whatever they ask, I need you to cover for me, okay?
Lauren said to me, "You need to vouch for me." I think I was a little dumbfounded. I just remember thinking, why in the hell would I need to vouch for you?
Hi, ma'am. Is Lauren home?
They asked for Lauren, and I said, yeah, he's here. And Lauren went out with them, and they were out there for a little while, and they were questioning Lauren and whatnot. At one point, the detectives talked to me briefly, too, for a couple of minutes. Asked me if I knew Cindy, if I had heard anything, if I knew where she was.
When was the last time you've seen her?
But they also asked, was Lauren home last night? Do you know what time he got home last night? Those types of questions. And I lied to the cops.
I fell asleep early.
I told them that I had fallen asleep on the couch, which was true. I told the cops that I had woken up roughly about anywhere between like 12:30 or so. And I told them that I had went to the back door and looked out and seen the light on underneath the barn door, which was not true. So I vouched for Lauren. I very much believe that Lauren was not guilty. He didn't have anything to do with Cindy's disappearance. Why in the hell would he? But I was afraid of him, that he would know that I didn't vouch for him, that he would probably kill me. As time goes by, it went into a couple days and then a week and then a couple weeks, and she's still missing. Well, at this point, I remember thinking, well, she's still missing. Something bad happened. And it's in the newspaper and it's on the TV. And it gets very, very overwhelming and very scary because you just don't know what the hell's going on or what's going to happen. For me, there was maybe little moments of thinking, well, God, did Lauren have something to do with this? Is Lauren responsible? Does he know where Cindy is? I think it must have sank in that it was a serious situation and this girl is still missing, and these people don't need anyone telling a white lie about their daughter or a person that the detectives are looking for. I want to say that it was within a couple of weeks, maybe a month or so. I went down to the police station and I said, look, I lied. I did not see the barn light on. Lauren was not home. I went to bed and Lauren woke me up the next morning to tell me he was leaving to go hunting. I decided to be honest with the detectives and tell them the truth because that was the right thing to do. I should have never told them a lie in the first place. And it's something that I did back then, and I wish I could go back and change that. I would have never done that. After Lauren was arrested, the next time I seen Lauren was in court when he was officially charged. And I went into the courtroom expecting Lauren to be formally charged with one count of murder, and he was actually charged with 5 counts of murder. And the whole courtroom just kind of let out this gasp, disbelief. How in the hell do you go from 1 count of murder to 5 counts of murder?
Yeah, I know Cindy's parents must.
They're devastated. They are inconsolable. They pretty much know that we're only going to find a body. They pretty much know that by now.
We might not really go home and sit here and think that way because, that's sad.
Lauren in this video, still looking out for his own butt, still trying to talk his way out of stuff. No remorse, no remorse whatsoever. I would like to think that there was an ounce of good in Lauren, but even if there was just an ounce of good in him, it didn't make a damn difference because he still did very horrible things. So it just disgusts me at this point to hear him say those things because he was full of crap. Lauren told the detectives that Lauren and Wes met Cindy at the cemetery in Clements, and they drove out to a secluded area in Linden, and that Wes had raped and then murdered Cindy. And he stood by and watched, and he didn't do anything to stop it. If what Lauren told is true about the night that Cindy was murdered, and that he was just there, he wasn't a participant, he wasn't involved, how do you stand there and let someone be hurt and assaulted and murdered, and you just stand there and don't do anything about it? So whether he actually did something to Cindy, he stood by and he allowed it to happen, so he's just as guilty. It's upsetting to me because I married this person. I loved this person. Had children with this person. Sometimes I wish I had taken a different path in life that, that maybe I never met Lauren. But if I had never met Lauren and married him, I would have not had my 3 children. And as hard as everything was, I'm very grateful for my 3 kids. Because they're very good people. I love them very much. So, that's the part that I don't regret about my history with Lauren. It's still very upsetting to me to this day because as someone that I loved so much at one point in my life, this person was gone. This person took their own life. And my children's dad was gone. And Lauren had left a note that just simply said, "Tell my family I love them." And I remember that I got angry over that because I don't know why I would expect him to, but I got very angry that he didn't say anything specifically to me, that he loved me or that he was sorry. And so I felt really angry about that for a long time. I never got an apology. So this photograph here was taken in 2006, and this was at one of the facilities Lauren was incarcerated at. I continued to stay married to Lauren. I never divorced him. Even when Lauren was incarcerated, I was still very, very scared of him and terrified of him of what could happen. I was afraid he was capable of having me harmed by someone else or someone else killing me, or I didn't know the extent of what he was capable of, and that was very terrifying to me still. I think Lauren's death in some ways was kind of freeing for me because there was a weight that was lifted in a sense that it was finally over. I never told Lauren, "You just had no consideration, for what you've done to other people's lives, and quite frankly, you're a piece of." It took me a very, very long time to come out of a trauma mode, a survival mode. Somewhere along the line, I realized that if I didn't take care of myself, that I wasn't able to take care of my children. And I try very hard to make the best out of life and not waste time. There's a lot of time and moments that I wish I could take back, use differently, but you can't go back. You can only move forward.
This was around the time he tried to kill me. The fact that he could take a gun and point it at his child. I really believe he tried to end my life that day. There's no love. There's just nothing there.
There are certain dates etched into the collective memory of a nation, not by moments of triumph, but by profound, unfathomable tragedy and the deep, enduring scars they leave behind. April 19, 1993 is one of those days in the history of the United States of America. It is a day that continues to echo through the decades, serving as a grim reminder of the catastrophic collision between extremist faith and the absolute force of government law enforcement. What happened on the plains of Texas near a city called Waco was never merely an isolated incident involving a single individual committing a standard crime. It was instead a massive, terrifying, and deeply complex bloodbath rooted in apocalyptic ideology, psychological manipulation, and an armed standoff that slowly spiraled beyond the control of everyone involved. This tragedy stands today as one of the most agonizing and fiercely debated wounds in modern law enforcement history. It stripped away illusions, exposing the terrifying dangers inherent in radical religious cults, while simultaneously forcing a painful reckoning regarding the boundaries of government authority, tactical assault, and the delicate, precarious art of crisis negotiation during mass hostage situations. To understand the sheer scale and the horrifying aftermath of this event, one must first look at the psychological epicenter of the tragedy. At the absolute center of this dark narrative was a man named David Koresh. He was the self-proclaimed final messiah of the Branch Davidian sect. He transformed the Mount Carmel compound, an isolated rural property near Waco, into a heavily armed fortress isolated from the rest of society. Koresh did not merely lead his followers, he fundamentally fractured and rebuilt their perception of reality through severe psychological manipulation. He convinced his devoted congregation that the end of the world was not just a distant theological concept, but an imminent, bloody reality that was fast approaching. He preached that they were the chosen few and that they needed to be heavily armed to prepare for an inevitable holy war. The enemy in this apocalyptic vision was the United States government, which Koresh systematically referred to as Babylon, an entity of ultimate evil that would soon descend upon them to destroy their sacred way of life. This intense psychological conditioning and the creation of an us versus them mentality is the crucial key to understanding the profound tragedy that unfolded. It explains the blind, unwavering loyalty of the sect members. They were completely severed from outside perspectives, their minds entirely captive to the apocalyptic visions spun by their leader. This absolute devotion clarifies exactly why these individuals, including entire families, were willing to barricade themselves inside the compound and endure unimaginable conditions for 51 grueling days. The siege that followed the initial botched raid was a prolonged psychological and physical attrition. For nearly 2 months, the members of the sect were trapped inside their wooden fortress as the Federal Bureau of Investigation surrounded the perimeter. The government agents employed a strategy of relentless pressure. They cut off the electrical power, leaving the compound in darkness. They severed the water supply, creating severe physical hardships for the men, women, and children trapped inside. Beyond the deprivation of basic human necessities, the federal agents utilized extreme psychological warfare tactics. They subjected the barricaded believers to continuous aggressive sound and light manipulation designed to disorient, terrify, and break their resolve. Yet despite the darkness, the thirst, the deafening noises, and the blinding lights, the followers did not break. Their endurance was a chilling testament to the depth of their indoctrination. They believed they were living through the exact tribulations their leader had prophesied, and every action taken by the government outside only served to validate the apocalyptic teachings they had absorbed. Then came the final morning, April 19, 1993. After 51 days of a tense, stagnant standoff, the federal authorities made the fateful decision to force a conclusion. They deployed heavy armored vehicles to breach the walls of the Mount Carmel compound. The strategy involved injecting tear gas deep into the building to force the occupants out into the open. Instead of a surrender, what followed was an absolute nightmare. A massive inferno suddenly erupted, rapidly engulfing the sprawling wooden structure. The fire moved with terrifying speed, leaving no chance for those deep inside to escape the choking smoke and the searing heat. When the flames finally died down and the ashes cooled, the true horrific cost of the siege was revealed to the world. 76 members of the sect perished inside the compound. Among the charred remains was the leader, David Koresh. But the most devastating, the most heartbreaking aspect of this loss of life was the presence of the innocent. 25 children died that day. They were young lives completely innocent of the complex ideological war being waged between their parents' leader and the government. They were trapped in a fortress they did not choose to build, dying in a fire they did not comprehend. Their deaths transformed the event from a law enforcement operation gone wrong into a profound human catastrophe. The ashes of Mount Carmel had not even settled before the intense, fierce, and enduring debate began over the true cause of the fatal fire. This dispute remains the absolute epicenter of all historical and legal arguments surrounding the Waco tragedy. On one side, the official government stance and subsequent formal investigative reports firmly concluded that the sect members themselves intentionally started the fires. According to these official accounts, the members engaged in a coordinated act of mass suicide, purposely igniting the blaze upon the direct orders of their leader as the armored vehicles tore through their walls. The government maintained that this was the final desperate act of a doomsday cult determined to fulfill its own apocalyptic prophecy rather than submit to federal authority. However, a completely different narrative emerged from the surviving supporters of the sect and various independent analysts who scrutinized the events of that day. They presented a highly critical counter-argument, placing the blame squarely on the actions of the federal agents. They argued that the fire was not a deliberate act of suicide, but a disastrous accident triggered by the aggressive tactical assault. According to this perspective, the heavy armored vehicles, while smashing through the structure, knocked over internal containers of flammable liquid and pressurized gas. This spilled fuel, they argued, was then tragically ignited by the smoke grenades deployed by the federal agents to obscure visibility and deploy the tear gas. This ongoing dispute between the theory of a deliberately ordered mass suicide and a catastrophic accidental ignition caused by reckless government tactics created a deep permanent fracture in the public perception of the event. The destruction of the Mount Carmel compound and the massive loss of human life did not end the story. Instead, the flames of Waco ignited a slow-burning fuse that would eventually detonate across the nation in a horrifying echo of violence. The tragedy generated immediate and intense political and social fallout. The imagery of federal tanks assaulting a religious compound and the subsequent deaths of dozens of American citizens, including so many children, sent shockwaves through specific segments of the population. It became a profound rallying cry. For extreme right-wing militias and deeply anti-government groups across the United States, Waco was not seen as a tragedy, but as a confirmation of their darkest fears. To them, it was absolute, undeniable proof that the federal government had become a tyrannical force willing to slaughter its own citizens to enforce its will. The anger, the paranoia, and the deep-seated resentment within these radicalized circles boiled over. They viewed the actions of the law enforcement agencies as an act of war against the American people, and in their minds, such an act demanded severe retribution. This simmering hatred culminated in another dark day for the nation exactly 2 years later. On April 19, 1995, a young man, deeply radicalized by the events at Waco and consumed by anti-government fury, decided to exact his revenge. His name was Timothy McVeigh. Driven by the memory of the burning compound, he parked a massive truck bomb directly in front of the federal building in downtown Oklahoma City. The resulting explosion tore the face off the structure and caused catastrophic damage. The human toll of this retaliatory act was staggering. 168 people lost their lives in the Oklahoma City bombing, marking it as the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in the history of the United States. The blood spilled in Oklahoma City was directly tied to the ashes of Waco. The chain reaction of radicalization, violence, and profound tragedy demonstrates the terrifying long-term consequences of the 51-day standoff. It shows how the psychological manipulation of one man preparing his followers for war against the government ultimately led to a chaotic and fatal climax that in turn inspired an even greater massacre years later. The story of Waco is a grim exploration of absolute belief, the terrifying power of coercive control, and the devastating consequences that unfold when the immovable force of law enforcement collides with the unyielding walls of extreme ideological fanaticism. It is a narrative that demands careful reflection on the value of human life, the immense heavy responsibility of those in power, and the devastating intergenerational trauma caused by unresolved conflicts. The loss of those 25 children inside the compound and the 168 souls in Oklahoma City serves as a permanent, haunting reminder of the high price of this deeply tragic saga. To truly comprehend the catastrophic loss that occurred on the plains of Central Texas, we must first look beyond the smoke and the sensational headlines that dominated the news cycle in the spring of 1993. We must shift our focus from the armored vehicles and the tactical gear of the federal agents and instead look closely at the wooden walls of the Mount Carmel Center. We need to understand who is inside that compound and how they came to be there. The popular narrative often reduces the inhabitants to a monolithic group of brainwashed zealots, completely devoid of agency or humanity. But the reality is far more complex and deeply heartbreaking. The people who perished within those walls were a diverse group of individuals seeking spiritual fulfillment, searching for a sense of belonging in an unpredictable world. They were mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters, and most tragically, they were innocent children who knew no other life than the one dictated to them within the confines of their isolated community. They came from various backgrounds, varying levels of education, and different parts of the country drawn together by a singular charismatic force that promised them absolute certainty in a chaotic universe. The landscape surrounding Waco, Texas, provided the perfect physical setting for this kind of intense ideological isolation. The sprawling plains, the relentless sun, and the vast open spaces created a natural barrier between the Mount Carmel Center and the secular world they sought to leave behind. This isolation was not merely geographical, it was fundamentally psychological. It was carefully constructed and meticulously maintained by a man who understood the profound power of separating his followers from dissenting voices and alternative perspectives. Before he became the infamous figure recognized around the globe, he was an aspiring musician with a troubled past who managed to systematically weave a web of absolute theological dominance over his congregation. He did not achieve this control overnight. It was a slow, insidious process of manipulation where spiritual seeking was slowly twisted into unwavering obedience. He positioned himself as the sole conduit to the divine, the final prophet entrusted with the task of decoding the ultimate mysteries of the universe and guiding his chosen people through the impending apocalypse. The environment inside the Mount Carmel compound was entirely structured around this apocalyptic vision. Every aspect of daily life, every interpersonal relationship, and every personal decision was filtered through the lens of a coming war against the forces of darkness. The outside world, specifically the federal government of the United States, was painted as the ultimate enemy, the embodiment of a modern Babylon intent on destroying their sacred community. This relentless psychological conditioning stripped away the individual identities of the followers, replacing their personal ambitions and desires with a collective mandate to prepare for the end of times. They were taught that their salvation depended entirely on their absolute loyalty to their leader and their willingness to endure whatever hardships were necessary to defend their faith. This was not a community built on mutual respect or democratic principles. It was a heavily fortified theocracy ruled by a single unquestioned authority. Beneath the surface of this intense spiritual preparation lay a deeply disturbing reality regarding the internal dynamics of the group. The leader utilized his self-proclaimed divine status to implement practices that systematically shattered the traditional family structures of his followers. He instituted a mandatory system of polygamy exclusively for himself, claiming a theological mandate to build a new lineage for the impending kingdom of heaven. This doctrine, however, was not limited to consenting adult women. It extended its dark reach into the most vulnerable segment of the population within the compound. The chilling reality of this practice involved the exploitation of minors, young girls who were subjected to a deeply coercive environment where abuse was framed as a sacred duty. The parents of these children, manipulated by a twisted sense of spiritual obligation and entirely dependent on the leader for their salvation, were compelled to surrender their daughters. This systematic violation of innocence represents one of the most agonizing layers of the tragedy, emphasizing the profound danger of absolute power operating behind the closed doors of a radical religious sect. The children inside Mount Carmel were victims long before the first shot was ever fired. They were captives in a psychological prison built by the adults they trusted most. As the psychological walls grew thicker, the physical reality of the compound also began to change, mirroring the escalating paranoia of its leader. The prophecy of an inevitable conflict with the government necessitated a tangible defense. The Mount Carmel Center slowly transitioned from a rural religious retreat into a heavily armed fortress preparing for a literal war. The leader orchestrated a massive operation to stockpile weaponry, accumulating an arsenal that included hundreds of illegal firearms. The quiet hum of daily life was increasingly replaced by the sounds of tactical drills and the mechanical assembly of deadly weapons. They were not merely preparing for a spiritual battle, they were actively arming themselves for a physical confrontation with law enforcement. The accumulation of these weapons was a direct manifestation of the apocalyptic ideology deeply ingrained in the minds of the followers. They firmly believed that they were the righteous few destined to stand against an overwhelming evil force. The firearms were not viewed as tools of aggression, but as holy instruments of self-defense necessary for their ultimate survival in the final days of humanity. This massive accumulation of illegal weaponry was the critical turning point that inevitably drew the attention of federal law enforcement, specifically the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. The government could no longer ignore the reports of a heavily armed, militarized group operating just outside of a major city. The perceived threat was immense, and the imperative to enforce the law became unavoidable. The presence of such a vast arsenal transformed the situation from a matter of strange religious practices into a severe public safety crisis. However, the approach taken by the authorities failed to fully comprehend the deeply entrenched psychological reality of the people inside the compound. The government viewed the weapons as a standard criminal violation and a legal enterprise that needed to be dismantled through standard law enforcement procedures. They did not grasp that to the people inside Mount Carmel, these weapons were inextricably linked to their faith, their salvation, and their very existence. The followers were not ordinary criminals motivated by financial gain or malice. They were true believers completely convinced of their righteous cause. This fundamental disconnect in understanding set the stage for a catastrophic collision. When the government began to plan its intervention, they were preparing for a tactical raid on a criminal enterprise. The followers, however, were preparing for the fulfillment of a prophecy, the arrival of Babylon, to destroy their holy ground. Every action taken by the authorities, every surveillance flight, every piece of gathered intelligence was interpreted by the leader and his congregation as absolute confirmation that the end was truly upon them. The tension in the weeks leading up to the initial confrontation was palpable, a tightening coil of paranoia and aggressive preparation on both sides. Inside the wooden walls of the compound, the atmosphere must have been heavily laden with a mixture of intense fear and profound spiritual anticipation. The parents held their children close, knowing that the prophesied battle was approaching. The men cleaned their weapons, reinforcing their positions and steadying their resolve against the impending threat. The leader moved among them, his voice a constant source of reassurance and fatalistic command, binding their fates entirely to his own. They were completely severed from any outside voice of reason or alternative interpretation of events. Their reality was entirely singular, absolute, and terrifyingly dangerous. They were locked into a trajectory that allowed for no compromise and no peaceful resolution. The stage was tragically set for an explosive encounter. The victims of this tragedy were not merely those who perished in the final devastating fire. The victimization began much earlier, rooted in the initial moments of manipulation and the slow, systematic dismantling of their critical thinking. The adults were victims of a coercive control that weaponized their deepest spiritual desires. The children were victims of a horrifying betrayal of trust, stripped of their innocence and forced to live in a militarized environment completely alien to a normal childhood. They were all trapped within a fatal paradigm where the very concept of surrender was equated with eternal damnation. Understanding this deeply ingrained psychological state is absolutely essential to comprehending the unimaginable horror of the 51-day siege that would soon follow. It explains the horrifying endurance, the refusal to yield, and the ultimate devastating conclusion that shocked the conscience of the entire nation. When we examine the portrait of these individuals, we must hold two conflicting truths simultaneously. We must acknowledge the grave danger posed by their massive arsenal and their militant posture, while also recognizing their profound vulnerability as human beings caught in the grip of an absolute psychological captivity. They were mothers preparing meals in the shadow of illegal firearms. They were fathers studying scriptures while standing guard at barricaded windows. They were innocent children playing in the hallways of a building that was destined to become their tomb. This complex duality is the true horrifying heart of the tragedy. It forces us to confront the terrifying reality that ordinary individuals seeking meaning and connection can be meticulously guided down a path of radicalization that ends in total destruction. The story of their lives before the arrival of the federal agents is a stark cautionary tale about the immense power of charismatic authority and the devastating consequences of unchecked psychological manipulation. The collision course was permanently set, and the vast open plains of Texas were about to witness a human catastrophe of unprecedented and heartbreaking proportions. The psychological environment fostered within the Mount Carmel Center was carefully designed to ensure that no single member could ever envision a life beyond the perimeter of their rural sanctuary. The leader employed sophisticated techniques of isolation, emotional exhaustion, and relentless ideological reinforcement to bind the community together in a state of constant heightened anxiety. He dictated their diet, their sleep schedules, and their access to information from the outside world, ensuring that his voice was the only one that truly mattered. This profound level of control made the members entirely dependent on him, not just for their spiritual guidance, but for their very understanding of reality. When he told them that the government was preparing an assault, they had absolutely no reason to doubt him. Their entire worldview had been meticulously constructed to support this exact narrative. The illegal firearms they possessed were the physical manifestation of their unwavering belief in his terrible prophecy. For the children growing up inside this environment, the concept of normalcy was entirely warped. They did not experience the standard milestones of childhood. Instead, they were indoctrinated into a militarized theology from the moment they could comprehend language. They were taught to view the outside world with intense suspicion and fear, believing that anyone who did not follow their leader was fundamentally evil and destined for destruction. Their innocence was systematically weaponized, serving as a tool for the leader to further bind their parents to his will. The tragic reality is that these children had no voice, no choice, and no possible avenue of escape. They were entirely at the mercy of the adults around them, who were in turn completely captive to a deeply destructive ideology. The heavy weight of this psychological subjugation forms the true tragic core of the story, demanding deep empathy for those who were powerless to change their horrifying fate. As the days ticked down toward the end of February, the atmosphere within the compound reached a fever pitch of anticipation. The constant drills, the checking of ammunition, the relentless sermons all pointed toward an inevitable and violent clash. The followers stood ready, their minds completely sealed against any possibility of peaceful surrender, firmly believing that their ultimate sacrifice was exactly what their apocalyptic doctrine demanded. Their devotion was absolute, their preparation was complete, and their isolation was absolute, leaving them waiting in the Texas heat for the devastating arrival of the forces they believed would usher in the end of the world. The morning of February 28, 1993, dawned with a deceptively calm sky over the quiet expanses of McLennan County, Texas. Outside the Mount Carmel compound, the air was thick with the silent, suffocating tension of a long-gestating confrontation that had finally reached its boiling point. For weeks, federal authorities had been meticulously planning their move, believing that a show of overwhelming force combined with the element of surprise would secure a swift and decisive victory. They were operating under the conviction that the threat posed by David Koresh and his followers had reached a level of danger that necessitated an immediate and aggressive law enforcement response. The objective was to execute a legal search warrant, seize the massive cache of illegal firearms, and bring an end to the dangerous activities occurring within the fortress. However, the federal agents remained largely oblivious to the depth of the indoctrination and the level of defensive readiness inside the wooden walls they intended to breach. The plan was for a high-stakes, tactical raid involving a large contingent of Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, ATF, agents who approached the compound in total silence, attempting to maintain the advantage of surprise. Yet, the element of surprise had vanished long before they reached the front door. Koresh and his inner circle had been alerted, and the defensive posture they had spent months cultivating shifted instantly into a state of active combat. As the federal agents moved into position, the stillness of the morning was shattered by a deafening, chaotic exchange of gunfire that erupted from multiple points simultaneously. It was a violent, desperate collision of two diametrically opposed realities. For the agents, this was a routine, if dangerous, tactical maneuver to enforce the law. For the followers, it was the beginning of the prophesied war, the ultimate validation of their leaders' apocalyptic teachings. The exchange of fire was intense, indiscriminate, and devastatingly lethal. The quiet, rural property was transformed into a theater of war within seconds. Bullets tore through the wooden siding of the building and the soft morning light, finding targets with indiscriminate brutality. In the confusion, the strategic advantage expected by the federal authorities evaporated under a hail of defensive fire from within the compound. The agents found themselves pinned down, exposed, and engaged in a firefight that was far more sophisticated and organized than they had anticipated. 4 federal agents were tragically killed in the opening salvos, their lives cut short in a struggle that had spiraled far beyond the scope of a standard search warrant execution. At the same time, 6 members of the Branch Davidian sect lost their lives, caught in the crossfire of a battle they had been conditioned to believe was inevitable. The loss of life was instantaneous, jarring, and signaled a catastrophic failure of the initial operation. As the smoke began to clear and the initial intensity of the shootout subsided, the immediate reality became clear. The raid had not achieved its objective. Instead, it had ignited a volatile, unpredictable situation that was now spiraling into a long-term crisis. The federal authorities were forced to retreat, leaving the perimeter secured, but the core problem entirely unresolved. The Mount Carmel compound remained an impregnable, heavily armed fortress, and the followers, fueled by the adrenaline of the battle and the confirming nature of the violence in their theological framework, were now even more deeply entrenched. The event had fundamentally shifted from a tactical operation to a 51-day hostage and siege situation. The federal government, reeling from the loss of its agents and the failure of the initial raid, turned to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, to take control of the scene, marking the beginning of a long, agonizing period of standoff that would hold the nation in suspense. Inside the compound, the atmosphere was a complex, harrowing blend of defiance and trauma. The survivors of the initial shootout were not merely soldiers in a war. They were individuals who had just witnessed death and were now living in a state of absolute, heightened survivalism. The psychological grip of David Koresh only tightened in the wake of the violence. He framed the survival of the compound as a divine victory, a testament to their chosen status and their protection by the divine. The followers, traumatized by the loss of their comrades and terrified by the presence of the massive, looming federal force outside, found no other path than to lean deeper into the singular narrative provided by their leader. They were trapped, not just by the physical barricades erected around them, but by the impenetrable logic of their own belief system. Every passing hour, every negotiation attempt, and every tactical maneuver by the FBI reinforced the narrative that they were under siege by the forces of the modern world. The FBI's approach to the subsequent 51-day standoff was characterized by an attempt to balance patience with relentless, escalating pressure. They established a command post nearby, deploying negotiators, psychologists, and tactical experts tasked with convincing Koresh and his followers to surrender peacefully. The negotiations, which spanned over 7 weeks, were incredibly complex, involving long, rambling conversations that often delved into deep theological debates. Koresh proved to be a formidable, elusive, and deeply manipulative negotiator. He was able to draw out the discussions, playing on the FBI's desire to resolve the situation without further loss of life, while simultaneously reinforcing his authority over his followers. He would often speak of surrender in abstract, theological terms that never materialized into concrete action, effectively turning the negotiation process into a tool to buy time and maintain his control. Meanwhile, outside the walls, the federal strategy became one of systematic, psychological attrition. The decision was made to create an environment of extreme discomfort to pressure those inside into abandoning their position. The electrical power to the compound was cut, plunging the occupants into total darkness at night. The water supply was disrupted, adding a layer of physical hardship that affected everyone inside, including the most vulnerable. Beyond these deprivations, the FBI utilized sophisticated psychological warfare, broadcasting high-volume, aggressive sounds and blinding, disorienting lights toward the compound around the clock. The intention was to break the will of the followers, to make the internal reality of the compound so unbearable that they would be forced to seek release. However, this strategy failed to account for the depth of the ideological conditioning. To the followers, the lack of electricity, the thirst, and the barrage of noise were not merely irritants. They were manifestations of the trials prophesied by their leader. Each day they survived was another day of righteousness, another day of standing firm against the encroaching evil of the modern world. The psychological warfare, rather than weakening the resolve of the followers, arguably served to strengthen the bond between them and their leader. They viewed their suffering as a prerequisite for their eventual salvation, a sacrifice necessary to prove their loyalty. Koresh continued to move among them, preaching, offering reassurance, and framing every action by the FBI as further proof of his predictions. The isolation from the outside world became absolute, and with it, the potential for any dissenting voice to reach the members within the compound was effectively eliminated. The children, oblivious to the political and tactical machinations of the adults, continued to live in this highly abnormal, high-stress environment, their lives entirely dictated by the decisions and beliefs of the individuals in control of their daily existence. The standoff became a static, terrifying cycle, with the world outside watching in horror as the days turned into weeks, and the hope for a peaceful resolution gradually withered away. The dynamics of the siege were, at every level, characterized by a fundamental, tragic disconnect. The federal authorities were operating from a paradigm of logic, legalism, and strategic planning, unable to fully grasp the profound, irrational power of the apocalyptic belief system they were facing. They viewed the members of the Branch Davidian sect as hostages or indoctrinated captives who could be reasoned with or pressured into surrender. The followers, however, were operating from an entirely different, internal reality where surrender was a concept devoid of meaning, and the arrival of the federal government was the realization of their ultimate existential dread. This failure of communication and empathy created a vacuum that was filled only by increasing frustration, paranoia, and the inevitable escalation of the conflict. The standoff was a mirror reflecting the deep, structural failures in how society and government confront the reality of radical, isolated communities. As the days stretched into weeks, the toll on both sides of the perimeter began to mount. The FBI agents, forced to maintain their positions in a grueling, unending wait, were subjected to their own form of psychological strain, constantly assessing the risk and the potential for a catastrophic turn of events. Inside the compound, the physical deterioration was evident, yet the ideological fervor remained, if anything, more intense. The 51 days were not a period of stasis. They were a slow-motion collapse toward a resolution that had been set in motion from the moment the first shots were fired in late February. The standoff was a period of sustained, high-stakes pressure where every decision carried immense weight, yet every decision seemed to lead closer to the tragic, inevitable conclusion. The Mount Carmel compound had become an island in the middle of Texas, a place where time, reality, and hope were entirely suspended, held in place by the crushing, absolute force of competing ideologies and the tragic inevitability of a confrontation that had already cost far too many lives. The 47th, 48th, and 49 days of the siege passed with a sense of suffocating stillness that betrayed the volatility lurking just beneath the surface. At the FBI command post, the internal calculus of the standoff had shifted from the pursuit of a peaceful, negotiated surrender to an agonizing reevaluation of tactical options. The agency's senior leadership was increasingly confronted with the reality that their primary strategy of attrition, the constant barrage of psychological stimuli, the severing of essential utilities, and the repetitive, exhausting rounds of communication, was yielding diminishing returns. David Koresh had proven to be an adversary whose psychological grip on his followers was absolute. He was not a leader who could be bought, bullied, or reasoned out of his position because he believed, with every fiber of his being, that he was the central figure in an unfolding divine drama that required his continued resistance. The negotiators, who had spent hundreds of hours attempting to establish a human connection, reported back that their efforts were consistently met with a combination of theological sermons and calculated stalling. The decision-makers within the federal government began to operate under the harrowing assumption that if the standoff were allowed to continue indefinitely, the conditions inside the compound would only deteriorate further, potentially resulting in an even more catastrophic, unpredictable, and disorganized conclusion. The investigative process leading to the final decision to intervene was driven by a complex synthesis of intelligence reports, psychological profiles, and a growing apprehension regarding the health and safety of the children. Federal investigators, working in concert with intelligence analysts, continuously pored over evidence regarding the internal state of the compound. They received reports suggesting that the children were being subjected to harsh living conditions, inadequate nutrition, and the pervasive psychological trauma of the military-grade weapons training they were being forced to undergo. Furthermore, the evidence retrieved from forensic experts and surveillance footage painted a grim picture of a society that had completely internalized its apocalyptic narrative. The investigation revealed that the followers were not just holding out. They were actively preparing for a final act of defense, reinforcing the building to serve as a literal and figurative fortress. Every search warrant execution attempt or tactical reconnaissance flight was analyzed through the lens of assessing the risk of a spontaneous outburst of violence. The investigators were caught in a trap of their own making, where the information they gathered only solidified their belief that the threat was imminent, which in turn increased the urgency to resolve the situation before the occupants chose to end it on their own terms. The FBI's tactical planning for what they termed an operation to conclude the standoff was characterized by a meticulous, if fundamentally flawed, effort to minimize the necessity of direct, lethal intervention. The proposed plan was to utilize heavy-duty armored vehicles, converted engineering tanks, to systematically dismantle sections of the compound's outer walls. The primary tactical innovation was the deployment of a specialized, non-lethal CS gas, a potent tear gas, which they hoped would render the environment inside the fortress impossible to inhabit. The logic was clear, if not cold. By forcing the occupants to breathe the gas, the federal agents intended to flush the followers out, coercing them to abandon their positions and surrender. They believed that by creating a situation that was physically intolerable but technically non-lethal, they could compel the sect members to prioritize their own survival over their devotion to their leader. It was a strategy of forced exposure, designed to bypass the psychological fortress Koresh had built by attacking the very physical capacity of the humans inside to remain within his structure. However, the investigation and tactical planning phases were marked by a profound failure to consider the likely response of the sect to such an aggressive breach. The investigators, perhaps blinded by their professional reliance on rational actor models, underestimated the apocalyptic conviction of the Branch Davidians. They failed to fully integrate the potential that the sect members might interpret the deployment of armored vehicles and the inhalation of gas as the final, apocalyptic assault they had long anticipated. The intelligence gathering had provided a clear picture of the arms cache, the structural fortifications, and the daily routines, but it had catastrophically missed the internal, existential reality of the people inside. The investigators failed to understand that to the people within the Mount Carmel Center, the act of surrender was not a logical alternative to death. It was, in their theological framework, a total betrayal of their faith and a guarantee of spiritual destruction. Therefore, the tactical plan to flush them out with gas was not seen as a chance for rescue. It was seen as the first strike in the final, concluding battle. The final days were defined by this critical divergence in perspective. While the FBI command staff in their mobile offices were checking boxes, securing authorizations, and finalizing the sequence of events for the breach, the individuals inside the compound were experiencing these final hours as the end of their world. The investigative records clearly show that there was no meaningful, high-level intelligence indicating that a peaceful, voluntary exit was on the horizon. The negotiations had hit a brick wall, and the tactical planners were left with the increasingly desperate conclusion that only an external force could bring the situation to an end. This desperation fueled the transition from negotiation to finality. The evidence shows that there were intense deliberations within the federal government about the optics of the operation, the legal risks involved in deploying such aggressive tactics, and the potential for a catastrophic loss of life. Yet, despite the presence of these concerns, the momentum of the situation, the cumulative weight of 51 days of failed diplomacy, and the perceived danger to the children, made the decision to move forward almost inevitable. Throughout this period, the investigation was not merely focused on the physical state of the compound, but on the psychological state of the primary antagonist. Analysts and behavioral scientists within the FBI attempted to deconstruct the mechanisms of Koresh's control, seeking a lever they could pull to fracture his authority. They studied his speeches, his musical recordings, and the accounts of former members to identify his core vulnerabilities. They realized, with increasing dread, that his charisma and his absolute command were immune to the standard tools of law enforcement negotiation. The investigation effectively hit a ceiling where the data they could gather was no longer sufficient to provide a roadmap to a peaceful resolution. This realization was the final, devastating trigger that compelled the command staff to move toward the use of force. The investigation had reached its limit, and the tactical decision-making was left to fill the vacuum. On the eve of the final operation, the atmosphere inside and outside the compound was taut with a silent, terrifying expectancy. The federal authorities, in their final briefings, emphasized the necessity of speed, the precise use of the gas, and the goal of preserving as many lives as possible. They were operating on a plan that assumed a controlled, step-by-step breakdown of the compound's defenses. They did not anticipate the fire. There was no intelligence in the final hours that suggested the existence of an accelerant-based suicide plan on such a massive scale, nor was there a contingency plan that accounted for the possibility that the breach itself would instantly transform the building into a death trap. The investigators and planners had built their final strategy on a foundation of manageable, tactical outcomes, completely missing the volatile, apocalyptic reality that had been developing for weeks inside. The investigation had provided them with the tactical details, but it had failed to provide the essential, human-centric wisdom that could have prevented the tragedy. They were prepared for a raid, but they were entirely unprepared for the reality that awaited them once the walls were breached. The stage was set, the calculations were made, and the final sequence of events was about to be unleashed, leading to the devastating conclusion that would forever change the relationship between the government and its citizens. The legal aftermath of the Waco tragedy began with the chilling quiet that followed the extinguishing of the flames and the discovery of the 76 bodies within the skeletal remains of the Mount Carmel compound. The legal proceedings that followed were not merely a series of criminal trials. They were a profound, nationwide autopsy of the federal government's actions, the legitimacy of the Branch Davidians' faith, and the volatile intersection of civil liberties and state power. The courtroom became the primary venue where the competing narratives of the fire, the government's assertion of a mass, cult-ordered suicide versus the defense's argument of a negligent, government-induced catastrophe, were exhaustively litigated. The trials were marked by intense public scrutiny as the events of April 19th had already begun to solidify into a potent symbol of government overreach in the collective consciousness of the American public. The legal teams for the surviving Branch Davidians were faced with the monumental task of defending individuals who were initially viewed by the mainstream as accomplices to a charismatic madman, forcing them to humanize a group whose actions were intrinsically linked to the death of federal agents and their own families. As the trials commenced, the prosecution focused heavily on the events of February 28th, presenting a narrative that characterized the Branch Davidians as a well-organized, militarized criminal enterprise that had premeditated an armed assault on federal officers. They utilized the vast array of confiscated weaponry, much of which had been modified to be fully automatic in violation of federal law, as physical evidence of a long-term, calculated threat that the government was constitutionally bound to neutralize. The testimonies from the surviving members were heavily scrutinized, with the prosecution attempting to peel back the layers of indoctrination and psychological control that had held the congregation in such absolute bondage to David Koresh. Every detail regarding the lifestyle inside the compound, the polygamous practices, and the indoctrination of the children was used to paint a portrait of a group that had effectively declared itself sovereign and beyond the reach of the law, thereby necessitating the harsh measures taken by the ATF and the FBI. Conversely, the defense strategy for the surviving members aimed to reframe the entire 51-day standoff as an act of self-defense against an escalating series of aggressive, illegal government provocations. They argued that the federal government, driven by a desire for a PR victory after the initial failed raid, had consistently ignored opportunities for a peaceful resolution in favor of an increasingly lethal strategy of intimidation and psychological warfare. The defense attorneys cross-examined federal agents and tactical planners with intense precision, focusing on the specific decision to use high-volume noise, blinding lights, and the eventual deployment of CS gas on a building they knew was occupied by children. They presented evidence attempting to cast doubt on the official conclusion that the members had ignited the fire, calling upon forensic experts who suggested that the breach by the armored vehicles could have easily ruptured chemical supplies or knocked over lanterns, creating an inevitable, accidental firestorm that the sect members would have been unable to contain. The trial proceedings were deeply emotional and often confrontational, as the courtroom became a stage for reliving the most painful moments of the siege. Survivors testified about the terror of being trapped within a crumbling building as the gas seeped into the vents, the desperate attempts to shield children from the smoke, and the overarching confusion that defined the final hours of the Mount Carmel community. These testimonies provided a stark counter-narrative to the dehumanizing language often used by the media and government officials to describe the sect. They spoke of their faith, their genuine belief that they were witnessing the end of days, and their profound trauma at seeing their community destroyed by the very authorities they had once trusted. The jury was faced with the nearly impossible task of weighing the tangible evidence of illegal weapon possession and the violence against the agents against the intangible, yet palpable, reality of the systemic breakdown and the catastrophic failure of the federal response. Throughout the months of testimony, the legal system was pushed to its limits, struggling to reconcile the letter of the law with the extraordinary, anomalous circumstances of the standoff. The prosecution pushed for maximum sentences for those involved in the deaths of the federal agents, arguing that regardless of the final outcome of the siege, the initial decision to open fire on law enforcement was a non-negotiable criminal act that demanded severe accountability. The defense, however, kept returning to the broader question of government conduct, asserting that the systemic failures of the FBI and ATF, the decision to disregard expert advice on negotiation, the aggressive deployment of military-grade tactics, and the subsequent cover-up of their own potential role in the ignition, rendered the government's pursuit of justice fundamentally hypocritical. This ongoing tension dominated the legal proceedings, creating a sense of unease that the courtroom could never truly provide a satisfactory resolution to the tragedy that had occurred in the Texas desert. The eventual verdicts were a complex reflection of this legal ambiguity. While some of the survivors were acquitted of the most severe charges, including conspiracy to murder federal agents. Others were convicted of lesser crimes related to the possession of illegal weapons and the resistance of law enforcement. The outcomes left neither side entirely satisfied, as the legal system effectively acknowledged the criminality of the group's preparations while simultaneously leaving the deepest, most troubling questions about the government's own culpability largely unresolved. The courtroom, for all its structure and procedure, was ultimately unable to heal the deep, societal wounds that the Waco tragedy had inflicted. The legal system acted as a filter, removing the most radical elements of the story and distilling it into a series of verdicts that failed to capture the chaotic, intersectional horror of the event. Furthermore, the legal aftermath extended beyond the walls of the courtroom as a series of federal hearings were launched to investigate the conduct of the FBI and the Department of Justice. These congressional hearings were characterized by intense, public interrogations of the officials responsible for the siege, forcing them to account for the specific tactical decisions that led to the death of the children and the destruction of the evidence. The transcripts of these hearings revealed a profound, internal fracturing within the government, as officials clashed over the failure of the negotiations and the catastrophic, unintended consequences of the final operation. These inquiries provided a small, granular window into the hubris and the fundamental lack of understanding that had characterized the government's approach from the very beginning. They highlighted the extent to which the federal agencies were caught in a bubble of their own expertise, unable to step back and recognize that they were dealing with a phenomenon, apocalyptic religious extremism, that required a strategy far more nuanced than simple tactical force. The legacy of these legal battles continues to reverberate in the American judicial system, serving as a permanent, cautionary case study on the dangers of excessive state force. The trials underscored the inherent, often fatal, difficulties in balancing the state's mandate to uphold the rule of law with the protection of minority religious groups, even those whose beliefs and practices are deemed extreme or dangerous by the mainstream. The legal system, in its attempt to provide a finality to the Waco story, only succeeded in highlighting its own limitations, showing that there are some tragedies so profound, so deeply rooted in the complexities of the human condition, that they cannot be fully rectified or understood through the narrow lens of a criminal trial. The survivors, the families of the fallen agents, and the general public were all left to grapple with a set of legal outcomes that, while technically final, felt fundamentally incomplete, mirroring the enduring, unresolved nature of the trauma itself. The trial was not just about determining guilt. It was about defining the parameters of what was considered acceptable government behavior in the eyes of the public. The defense team's persistence in bringing the actions of the federal government under the same microscope as the actions of the sect forced a national reckoning that lasted long after the final verdict was read. It opened a door for the public to question the authority of the state, and skepticism that was subsequently reinforced by the findings of the congressional investigations. The legal aftermath, in its entirety, stands as a testament to the fact that when the law is applied in a vacuum, devoid of empathy, understanding, or a recognition of the human elements involved, it can produce outcomes that feel just as cold and as destructive as the chaos it seeks to control. The tragedy at Waco, therefore, remains in a state of permanent, legal limbo, a case that is frequently reopened in the court of public opinion, where the verdict is always the same: that a system intended to protect had instead become an active participant in a catastrophic human disaster, leaving a legacy of doubt, division, and an enduring, painful search for the truth. The legacy of the tragedy at the Mount Carmel compound is not found in the sterile records of courtroom transcripts or the finality of legal verdicts, but in the enduring, haunting shadows it cast over the American psyche. The events of April 1993 remain a permanent, open wound in the nation's history, a constant reminder of how rapidly and catastrophically a breakdown in communication and a misunderstanding of intent can lead to the loss of innocent lives. The aftermath was not merely a period of reflection. It was a period of intense, often polarizing, transformation in how the American public viewed the role of federal law enforcement and the state's authority over the individual. Waco became the definitive touchstone for those who held a fundamental, deep-seated distrust of government power, providing the narrative foundation for an entire subculture of resistance. The images of the burning compound, the news reports of the children's deaths, and the subsequent, often conflicting explanations from the government created a deep-seated, generational trauma that continues to influence the national discourse today. Perhaps the most significant and devastating consequence of Waco was the inspiration it provided to those who sought to weaponize their anti-government sentiment. The anger that simmered in the wake of the fire was not dissipated by the legal proceedings. Instead, it grew, festering in the fringes of society where the tragedy was viewed as proof of a tyrannical regime. The most horrific manifestation of this resentment occurred exactly 2 years later in Oklahoma City, when the domestic terrorist Timothy McVeigh parked a truck filled with explosives in front of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. McVeigh's motivation was explicitly and directly linked to his obsession with the Waco siege, which he interpreted as the ultimate declaration of war by the federal government against the American people. The bombing was a direct act of retaliation, a brutal, indiscriminate attack that echoed the destruction of the Mount Carmel compound on a much larger and more terrifying scale. The lives lost in Oklahoma City, 168 souls, including children in a daycare center, serve as a permanent, tragic tether between the two events, illustrating the terrifying, long-term ripple effects of unresolved, systemic violence. Beyond the immediate, violent retaliations, the legacy of Waco resides in the fundamental shift in the relationship between the citizenry and the state. The tragedy forced a painful, necessary reckoning with the limits of law enforcement power. It raised critical, difficult questions about the use of force, the efficacy of negotiation, and the responsibility of the state to protect the lives of those it is tasked with apprehending, even when those individuals are viewed as extremists or threats. The failure at Waco became a gold standard case study for tactical training and crisis management, as law enforcement agencies across the country began to incorporate the lessons of the botched raid and the prolonged siege into their own operational procedures. The realization that an inflexible, force-heavy approach could lead to a catastrophic outcome caused a reevaluation of how authorities interact with religious groups, cults, and extremist organizations. There was a newfound emphasis on the importance of psychological expertise, patient diplomacy, and the need to avoid the kind of aggressive, ego-driven tactical decision-making that characterized the federal response in the Texas desert. However, the reflection on Waco also highlighted the persistent and often insurmountable challenge of dealing with groups whose foundational beliefs are built on isolation and the rejection of mainstream reality. The tragedy demonstrated that there are certain belief systems, specifically those rooted in apocalyptic dogma, that are inherently resistant to conventional methods of persuasion or compromise. The challenge for the state is to develop strategies that can effectively neutralize the threat posed by such groups without resorting to the very violence that the groups themselves claim to be anticipating and preparing for. The story of Waco serves as a reminder that when the government is faced with an adversary that does not share its commitment to the rule of law or the value of peaceful resolution, the potential for disaster is extreme. It forces us to ask how society can better protect vulnerable individuals, particularly children, from the influence of radical, isolated leaders before the situation reaches a point of no return. The human element of the tragedy remains the most profound aspect of its legacy. The 25 children who died in the fire did not choose their faith, their leader, or their fate. They were the most innocent of victims, trapped in a conflict they could not comprehend, let alone control. Their deaths shattered the public's perception of the government as a benevolent protector, instead presenting it as a clumsy, dangerous giant that could inflict immense, irreparable harm. The memory of these children, and of the adults who stood by their convictions to the very end, creates a lingering, uncomfortable sense of loss that transcends any political or legal argument. It challenges us to look beyond the labels of cultists, extremists, or law enforcement, and to see the individuals involved as humans caught in an impossible, fatal collision. The sorrow that resonates from the empty space where the Mount Carmel compound once stood is a testament to the fact that the price of this specific clash was paid by people who were, at their core, just as complex and capable of love and loss as anyone else. As we look back on the events of 1993 from the perspective of the present, the lessons of Waco seem more relevant than ever. In an age where information silos and ideological polarization have become increasingly common, the mechanisms of groupthink and isolation that allowed David Koresh to maintain his control are perhaps more prevalent than we would like to admit. The tragedy reminds us of the critical importance of maintaining channels of open communication, of questioning absolute authority, and of guarding against the dehumanization of those who hold different views. It warns against the dangers of institutional hubris, where the belief in one's own expertise and strategic superiority can blind the decision-makers to the human reality of a situation. The standoff and its devastating conclusion were not merely a historical oddity. They were a systemic failure that continues to serve as a mirror for our own societal fragility. The site of the Mount Carmel compound itself has become a place of silent, solemn reflection, where the grass grows over the earth that once held a community and its dreams of an apocalypse. It is a space that defies easy categorization, standing as both a testament to the dangers of radicalism and a monument to the failures of the state. For the survivors, the families of those lost, and the nation at large, the legacy of Waco is one of unfinished business, of questions that may never be fully answered, and of a sorrow that has not entirely faded with time. The tragedy asks us to consider the cost of our collective desire for certainty, for security, and for the resolution of conflicts that may not be solvable. It forces us to reconcile the reality of a modern, democratic state with the existence of communities that choose to operate outside its boundaries, and to find ways to balance the necessity of law with the profound, fundamental humanity of every person involved. In conclusion, the story of the Waco siege is a narrative that refuses to be neatly folded away into the past. It is a saga of extreme belief, of the terrifying power of charismatic manipulation, and of the devastating, ripple-like effects of a single, catastrophic miscalculation. The tragedy that claimed the lives of 76 individuals remains a central, defining moment in the history of American law enforcement, a grim marker of the limits of force and the necessity of empathy. By examining every facet of this event, from the initial fatal raid to the haunting aftermath of the Oklahoma City bombing, we are forced to confront the darkest aspects of our shared experience. We are reminded that the most profound tragedies are not those that happen in the distant, unfamiliar corners of the world, but those that occur within our own borders, among our own people, under the oversight of our own government. The legacy of Waco is a permanent, haunting call to be more vigilant, more compassionate, and more profoundly aware of the heavy, enduring weight of the decisions we make in the name of security, justice, and the truth. It is a saga that leaves us with a lingering, uncomfortable silence, a silence that speaks louder than any official report, demanding that we never forget the price of our mistakes and the fragile, precious nature of the lives that are caught in the crossfire of our competing, unyielding convictions. The ashes have long since scattered, but the truth of the tragedy at Waco continues to shape the conscience of a nation, serving as a solemn, essential reminder that the path to peace is found not in the victory of one force over another, but in the difficult, constant effort to understand, to listen, and to value every life before it is too late. The story of Waco is not just a true crime narrative. It is a human document of immense, tragic significance, a story that deserves to be remembered for the complexity of its participants and the enduring, painful lessons it offers to the future of a divided, but fundamentally interconnected society. The final echoes of the tragedy at Mount Carmel serve as a sobering meditation on the fragility of social cohesion and the dangers inherent in absolute ideological insulation. Looking back from the vantage point of more than 3 decades later, the event has ceased to be a simple news story and has instead matured into a complex societal myth, one that continues to be reinterpreted by every generation that encounters it. The lessons of Waco are not merely tactical or legal. They are profoundly existential, touching upon the fundamental human desire for belonging and the terrifying lengths to which individuals will go to protect a shared, exclusive reality. When we consider the narrative of the Branch Davidians, we are forced to confront a mirror image of our own anxieties about the state, authority, and the preservation of personal freedom. The tragedy remains a foundational element in the development of modern American skepticism, a historical pivot point where the perceived competence and benevolence of the federal government were fundamentally fractured in the eyes of a significant portion of the population. This continued resonance is, perhaps, the most lasting consequence of the siege. Waco did not end in April 1993. It shifted into a different, more pervasive existence in the collective consciousness. It became a shorthand, a cultural touchstone used to define the boundaries of resistance and to illustrate the potential costs of standing apart from the mainstream. For those who view the state with suspicion, the memory of the fire is a call to vigilance, a justification for the maintenance of personal defense, and a grim promise that the machinery of government, when left unchecked, will inevitably prioritize its own operational success over the lives of those it claims to be protecting. This legacy has influenced everything from the rhetoric of modern grassroots political movements to the way law enforcement agencies engage with suspected extremist groups, creating a cautious, often defensive, environment where the fear of repeating the Waco tragedy dictates policy and tactics. The psychological dimension of the tragedy, the way in which David Koresh was able to harness the desperate need for certainty among his followers, remains a subject of intense academic and behavioral study. It is a textbook case of how coercive control, when paired with an apocalyptic theology, can completely displace a person's inherent sense of self-preservation. Understanding the mechanisms of this process is perhaps the most important and yet the most elusive challenge in preventing future tragedies. It is a task that requires a delicate balance between respecting religious and personal freedom and recognizing the early warning signs of extreme, dangerous isolation. The tragedy teaches us that the path to radicalization is rarely a sudden leap. It is a gradual, insidious process of narrowing one's worldview until no alternative interpretation of reality is possible. The victims of Waco were not born into the fire. They were led there, step by painful step, through the systematic erosion of their own independent judgment. Furthermore, the story of the 25 children lost in the blaze continues to be the most painful, unresolved aspect of the narrative. Their presence in the compound, and their subsequent, unavoidable deaths, forces us to question the limits of parental and religious authority in the eyes of the law. How do we protect children who are being raised in an environment that is, by its very nature, hostile to the outside world? The tragedy at Waco shows that our legal and social systems were, and in many ways remain, ill-equipped to intervene in such situations without resorting to the very violence that endangers the children in the first place. This realization creates a haunting, persistent dilemma for society, a recognition that our commitment to individual liberty can sometimes provide the cover under which the most vulnerable are subjected to irreparable harm. It is a tension that has never been resolved, and one that continues to inform debates about child welfare, religious freedom, and the extent of state intervention. The physical site of the tragedy, now a quiet space in the Texas landscape, serves as a bridge between the past and the present. It is a place that demands a specific kind of engagement, a recognition of the history that occurred there without the imposition of modern judgment. It is a space for the families of the victims to grieve, for researchers to study, and for the public to reflect on the immense cost of the events that transpired. Its existence is a powerful, visual reminder that history is not just a series of abstract dates and decisions, but a sequence of real, physical consequences that continue to shape the geography of our society. The emptiness of the site today is a reflection of the profound silence that followed the fire, a silence that once represented the loss of a community and now serves as a canvas for our ongoing national attempt to understand the tragedy of Waco. As the years continue to pass, the details of the 51-day standoff may begin to blur in the general public memory, but the core themes of the event, the conflict between faith and state, the nature of ideological extremity, and the devastating cost of mismanaged authority, will remain as potent as ever. The story of Waco is a narrative about the limits of power and the persistence of the human spirit in its most vulnerable and its most radical forms. It is a story that requires us to be humble in the face of the unknown, to be skeptical of our own certainties, and to recognize that the most significant events in our history are often those that reveal the deepest fractures in our society. The tragedy forces us to look inward and ask what we are willing to sacrifice in the pursuit of our own truths, and how we can better ensure that the mistakes of the past are not destined to be repeated in the future. The legacy of the tragedy is also tied to the technological and societal shifts that have occurred since the 1990s. We now live in an era of unprecedented information access, where echo chambers and ideological bubbles are easier to construct than ever before. The psychological isolation that David Koresh achieved through physical distance can now be accomplished through digital curation, making the potential for radicalization and the formation of insular, extremist groups a global, rather than merely local, challenge. The lessons of Waco are, therefore, more relevant than ever. They serve as a warning about the fragility of our shared reality and the ease with which individuals can be pulled into alternative, destructive worldviews. The tragedy reminds us that the health of our society depends on our ability to reach across the ideological divides, to challenge the narratives that seek to isolate us, and to prioritize the value of human connection over the rigidity of our own convictions. In a final analysis, the Waco tragedy stands as a permanent, cautionary monument to the dangers of extremism and the weight of government accountability. It is a narrative that has been told and retold, analyzed and critiqued, yet it still resists a simple, satisfying conclusion. It is a story that lives in the gaps between the government's rhetoric and the lived reality of the Branch Davidians, the gaps between the law's intention and its execution, and the gaps between our national commitment to freedom and the tragic consequences of how that freedom is sometimes used. The legacy of Waco is not a set of instructions for the future. It is a set of uncomfortable, enduring questions that continue to challenge our understanding of ourselves, our government, and the meaning of justice. As long as we continue to struggle with these questions, the memory of those who lost their lives in the Texas desert will remain a central, defining element of the American experience, urging us to be better, to be wiser, and to be profoundly aware of the precious, fragile nature of the world we share. The story concludes not with a final answer, but with the ongoing, necessary task of reflection as we navigate the complex, often dark, landscape of our own history, forever guided by the light of the truth and the weight of the lives that were so tragically cut short in the pursuit of a vision that could only ever lead to ruin. The path forward is built on the ruins of the past, and it is our collective responsibility to ensure that the ground we walk upon is informed by the difficult, painful, and essential memory of what happened in the silence of that Texas spring. The conclusion of the Waco tragedy is not found in the finality of the events in April of 1993, but in the persistent, evolving dialogue it continues to generate about the nature of power, the sanctity of life, and the inherent tension within a democracy that seeks to balance security with individual liberty. Every aspect of this event, from initial tactical planning to the harrowing, chaotic aftermath, has been subjected to decades of rigorous academic, legal, and public scrutiny, yet the core of the tragedy remains deeply uncomfortable and profoundly resistant to simple categorization. The story has transformed from a contemporary news event into a historical marker, a point of reference used to calibrate our understanding of the dangers posed by both extreme religious fervor and the potential for federal overreach. It serves as a reminder that the institutions we rely on for protection are staffed by human beings, and that the intersection of human ego, institutional momentum, and volatile, unpredictable circumstances can lead to outcomes that exceed the capacity of even the most sophisticated systems to contain or control. The evolution of the narrative surrounding Waco has been marked by a shift from a focus on the sensational, immediate violence to a more nuanced, agonizing analysis of the systemic failures that preceded it. The initial media representation, which often leaned into the binary framing of the state versus the cult, has given way to a more complex appreciation for the individuals caught in the crossfire. This shift is crucial, as it allows for a more profound empathy for the victims and a more sophisticated understanding of how radicalization functions within isolated communities. It challenges us to look beyond the surface level of the conflict and to interrogate the psychological, social, and political conditions that allowed such a catastrophe to take shape in the heart of the Texas countryside. By moving away from the simplistic tropes of the era, we are better able to grasp the true weight of the tragedy, the irreparable loss of human life, and the long-term, intergenerational trauma that continues to affect the survivors and the families of the fallen. In the decades following the siege, the lessons drawn from Waco have been integrated into the standard curriculum of crisis management and law enforcement training, transforming the way modern agencies prepare for and engage with high-stakes standoff scenarios. The emphasis on psychological de-escalation, the utilization of specialized negotiation teams, and the prioritization of patient, intelligence-driven strategies are direct, tangible responses to the failures observed at Mount Carmel. This institutional learning is a vital aspect of the tragedy's legacy, representing a conscious, concerted effort to ensure that the mistakes of 1993 are never repeated. It reflects an acknowledgement that the traditional model of aggressive, tactical enforcement is not only ineffective when dealing with ideologically driven actors, but is also potentially disastrous. The shift toward a more patient, analytical approach underscores the fundamental necessity of valuing the safety of the occupants over the rapid resolution of a criminal situation. However, the persistent, haunting nature of the tragedy also reminds us that no amount of training or procedural reform can entirely eliminate the risk of such a catastrophe. The human element, the unpredictable nature of individual psychology, the volatility of deep-seated convictions, and the potential for miscommunication will always remain a wild card in any standoff situation. Waco serves as a permanent, cautionary beacon, reminding all who hold positions of authority that the consequences of their actions are not abstract policy outcomes, but real, devastating, and irreversible human realities. It challenges leaders to approach their duties with a deep, reflexive humility, acknowledging the limits of their knowledge and the potential for their interventions to cause far more harm than good. This ongoing requirement for vigilance and moral awareness is perhaps the most essential and most difficult lesson to be drawn from the entire saga. The cultural impact of Waco is equally profound, continuing to shape the landscape of American political discourse and the ongoing debate about the role of the federal government in the lives of its citizens. The tragedy remains a powerful, symbolic tool, frequently invoked in discussions about civil liberties, the right to bear arms, and the boundaries of state authority. It has become a lens through which contemporary conflicts are interpreted, a historical precedent that frames our expectations of what the government is capable of doing and what the citizenry is entitled to resist. This persistent cultural relevance ensures that Waco will not fade into obscurity, but will remain a central, defining, and often contentious element of the national identity, reflecting the deep, structural divisions that continue to challenge the promise of a unified, democratic society. As we look toward the future, the legacy of Waco urges us to prioritize the creation of a society that is resilient against the forces of extremism and sensitive to the dangers of institutional hubris. This requires an ongoing commitment to transparency, to the protection of vulnerable communities, and to the maintenance of open, empathetic channels of communication across all segments of the population. We must strive to recognize the early warning signs of radicalization and to respond to them with care, intervention, and support rather than with isolation and the application of force. The tragedy serves as a constant, somber reminder that the health of our democracy is fundamentally dependent on our ability to manage our conflicts with wisdom, patience, and a deep, abiding respect for the value of every individual life. The story of the Branch Davidians and the federal response at Mount Carmel is a testament to the immense, complicated power of belief and the often tragic consequences of its collision with reality. It is a narrative that resists simple closure, existing in a permanent state of tension between the desire for justice and the reality of the loss. By continuing to tell this story, by interrogating its details, and by honoring the memory of those who died, we are engaging in a necessary, ongoing, and vital process of reflection. We are acknowledging that the weight of the past is never fully behind us, and that our ability to navigate the challenges of the future is deeply influenced by our willingness to confront the lessons of the tragedies that have shaped who we are today. Ultimately, the Waco siege is a human tragedy, one that demands that we be better, kinder, and more profoundly aware of the profound impact of our choices. It is a story that should humble us, frighten us, and inspire us to build a world where such a collision is no longer a possibility. The ashes may have long since been cleared from the plains of Texas, but the reality of what occurred there remains, etched into the conscience of a nation, serving as a solemn, essential reminder that the price of our mistakes is measured in the lives of the innocent, and that our only true protection against a recurrence is the constant, rigorous pursuit of empathy, understanding, and the truth. The journey through this history is long, winding, and deeply painful, but is a necessary journey for anyone seeking to understand the complexities of our shared societal existence. The legacy of the tragedy will continue to evolve, reflecting the values and the anxieties of each new generation that encounters it. It will remain a source of profound debate, a catalyst for institutional change, and a constant, sobering point of reference for all those who work in the service of the law and the protection of the public. The individuals involved, the decisions made, and the devastation that followed will be remembered not just as a historical event, but as a defining human narrative that speaks to the core of our moral and societal challenges. It is a story that belongs to us all, a story that we are all responsible for understanding, and a story that will continue to remind us of the fragile, precious nature of the lives that are entrusted to our care. In the final, enduring, and haunting silence that surrounds the memory of Waco, we find the impetus to do better, to listen more closely, and to cherish the connections that bind us together, lest we ever again descend into the catastrophic, devastating chaos that defines that tragic spring in the heart of Texas. The search for meaning in the aftermath of such profound loss is an ongoing, vital, and universal human endeavor, one that unites us in our common commitment to prevent the shadows of the past from darkening the promise of the future. The tragedy at Waco, with all its complexities, its failures, and its enduring, painful resonance, remains a foundational chapter in our history, demanding that we never look away, never forget, and never stop questioning the nature of the power we hold and the lives we are charged to protect. As we move forward, may we carry the weight of these lessons with us, using the memory of the past as a guide to the light, ensuring that the spirit of every individual lost in the fire continues to shape our commitment to justice, empathy, and the enduring, fundamental value of human life in all its forms. The finality of the Waco tragedy is not reached through a simple summary of its events, but rather through an ongoing, deep reflection on what it reveals about the vulnerability of our societal institutions and the persistent nature of human conviction. As the history of the Mount Carmel siege recedes further into the past, it crystallizes into a profound symbol of the fragility inherent in our collective security and the potential for devastating outcomes when the state and the individual collide in a state of absolute, ideological deadlock. The narrative that we have constructed around this event is one that continues to evolve, reflecting the shifting values, anxieties, and political realities of each new generation. It remains a stark, essential point of reference, reminding us that the preservation of democracy requires not only the strict adherence to the rule of law, but also a deep, ingrained commitment to the preservation of human life and the maintenance of open, empathetic communication channels, even in the most extreme and dangerous of circumstances. The process of deconstructing the tragedy at Waco has been a long and arduous journey of collective introspection. It has necessitated a hard look at the structural failures of federal law enforcement, the limitations of tactical intervention, and the profound difficulty of balancing the state's mandate to maintain public order with the constitutional protections afforded to minority groups, even those whose beliefs are perceived as dangerous or extreme by the broader society. The legacy of these failures has spurred a significant long-term effort to modernize the way agencies manage crisis situations, resulting in a more nuanced, sophisticated, and ultimately more humane approach to the resolution of high-stakes standoffs. This shift is a testament to the fact that the tragedy was not in vain. It catalyzed a vital, systemic evolution in how we view the responsibility of those in power to protect the lives of those they are charged with apprehending, even when that apprehension is deemed necessary. However, the haunting nature of the event, the memory of the children, the chaos of the fire, and the enduring, unanswered questions about the government's culpability, remains a powerful, emotional undercurrent that prevents the story from ever achieving a true sense of closure. It is a tragedy that continues to challenge our understanding of what it means to live in a free, democratic society, pushing us to confront the uncomfortable reality that such a state is not inherently immune to the same forces of extremism, paranoia, and catastrophic error that define the events in the Texas desert. The memory of the 76 lives lost serves as a sobering, permanent counterbalance to any sense of institutional self-satisfaction, reminding us that the cost of our mistakes is always borne by the most vulnerable and the most innocent. As we consider the trajectory of this history, we are reminded of the essential, ongoing need for skepticism and critical inquiry regarding the exercise of state power. The tragedy at Waco has become a cornerstone of American political consciousness, a touchstone for those who believe that the government must be held to a higher standard of accountability and that the actions of federal agencies must always be subjected to the most rigorous, public, and transparent review. This skepticism is not a sign of democratic weakness. It is, in fact, a source of resilience, a manifestation of the citizenry's commitment to ensuring that the state remains a servant of the people and that the authority it wields is always tempered by empathy, respect for individual rights, and an unwavering commitment to the truth. The study of the Waco standoff continues to offer invaluable insights into the psychology of radicalization and the dangers of closed, insular environments. It provides a granular look at the mechanisms by which charismatic individuals can gain absolute control over a community, creating a reality that is entirely decoupled from the shared, evidence-based world of the mainstream. These insights are increasingly relevant in our contemporary landscape, where digital silos and ideological echo chambers have made it easier than ever for such environments to take root and flourish. The lessons of Mount Carmel are therefore a vital, essential component of our defense against the proliferation of extremism, urging us to be proactive in our efforts to foster connection, challenge isolation, and promote a culture of openness and shared human understanding. Furthermore, the legacy of Waco continues to inform the way we perceive the intersection of faith and the law. It serves as a complex, nuanced study of the limits of religious freedom, prompting us to ask how far a state should go to accommodate the practices of a group that exists outside the norms of society. It forces us to reconcile the reality that our commitment to the protection of religious expression must be balanced against the necessity of ensuring that such expression does not lead to the exploitation, the harm, or the systemic dehumanization of others. This is a delicate, profoundly challenging balance, one that has no simple answers and that requires a constant, active, and deeply considered effort on the part of our judicial and legislative systems to navigate. In the final, enduring, and haunting silence that surrounds the memory of the Waco tragedy, we find the impetus to do better, to listen more closely, and to cherish the connections that bind us together, lest we ever again descend into the catastrophic, devastating chaos that defines that tragic spring in the heart of Texas. The search for meaning in the aftermath of such profound loss is an ongoing, vital, and universal human endeavor, one that unites us in our common commitment to prevent the shadows of the past from darkening the promise of the future. The story of Waco is not just a true crime narrative. It is a human document of immense, tragic significance, a story that deserves to be remembered for the complexity of its participants and the enduring, painful lessons it offers to the future of a divided, but fundamentally interconnected, society. The journey through this history is long, winding, and deeply painful, but is a necessary journey for anyone seeking to understand the complexities of our shared, societal existence. The legacy of the tragedy will continue to evolve, reflecting the values and the anxieties of each new generation that encounters it. It will remain a source of profound debate, a catalyst for institutional change, and a constant, sobering point of reference for all those who work in the service of the law and the protection of the public. The individuals involved, the decisions made, and the devastation that followed will be remembered not just as a historical event, but as a defining human narrative that speaks to the core of our moral and societal challenges. It is a story that belongs to us all, a story that we are all responsible for understanding, and a story that will continue to remind us of the fragile, precious nature of the lives that are entrusted to our care. In conclusion, the saga of the Waco siege stands as a permanent, cautionary monument to the dangers of extremism and the weight of government accountability. It is a narrative that has been told and retold, analyzed and critiqued, yet it still resists a simple, satisfying conclusion. It is a story that lives in the gaps between the government's rhetoric and the lived reality of the Branch Davidians, the gaps between the law's intention and its execution, and the gaps between our national commitment to freedom and the tragic consequences of how that freedom is sometimes used. The legacy of Waco is not a set of instructions for the future. It is a set of uncomfortable, enduring questions that continue to challenge our understanding of ourselves, our government, and the meaning of justice. As long as we continue to struggle with these questions, the memory of those who lost their lives in the Texas desert will remain a central, defining element of the American experience, urging us to be better, to be wiser, and to be profoundly aware of the precious, fragile nature of the world we share. The path forward is built on the ruins of the past, and it is our collective responsibility to ensure that the ground we walk upon is informed by the difficult, painful, and essential memory of what happened in the silence of that Texas spring. The truth of the tragedy continues to shape the conscience of a nation, serving as a solemn, essential reminder that the path to peace is found not in the victory of one force over another, but in the difficult, constant effort to understand, to listen, and to value every life before it is too late. The story of Waco is a human document of immense, tragic significance, a narrative that deserves to be remembered for the complexity of its participants and the enduring, painful lessons it offers to the future of a society that, while divided, is fundamentally interconnected, forever bound by the shared, haunting memory of a tragedy that need never have happened and must never be allowed to occur again. The final chapter of this long and agonizing examination of the Waco tragedy brings us back to the stark reality of the site today, a patch of land in Texas that now serves not just as a location, but as an enduring monument to the complexities of history and the heavy toll of human conflict. As time moves forward, the immediate sharpness of the pain has begun to dull, yet the core of the tragedy remains deeply embedded in the American consciousness, acting as a perennial challenge to our understanding of the relationship between the state and the individual. The story of Mount Carmel has moved beyond the realm of simple historical documentation and has entered the realm of myth, where it continues to inform, warn, and provoke. It is a narrative that forces us to look in the mirror and question the foundations of our societal structure, the limitations of our law enforcement agencies, and the profound, often tragic, cost of failing to bridge the gap between competing realities. Throughout this extensive inquiry, we have explored the various layers of the Waco siege, from the psychological manipulation employed by David Koresh to the tactical miscalculations of the federal agents, and from the devastating loss of life to the far-reaching political and social consequences that followed. Each of these components has provided a critical piece of the puzzle, yet the completed picture remains, by design, unfinished. This is perhaps as it should be, for a tragedy of this magnitude cannot be fully contained or adequately explained by any single perspective. It requires an ongoing, collective effort of memory, a commitment to interrogating the past, even when the answers we seek remain elusive or deeply uncomfortable. The tragedy, in all its complexity, serves as a testament to the fact that when we fail to see the humanity in those who are different from us, when we allow fear to dictate our actions, and when we abandon the path of empathy in favor of the certainty of force, the consequences can be truly catastrophic. The legacy of the 25 children who perished in the fire continues to be the most persistent and heartbreaking aspect of the narrative. Their absence in the world is a silence that demands a response that goes beyond formal investigations or legal outcomes. It is a demand for a society that values the protection of its most vulnerable members above all else, one that finds ways to intervene in the lives of those trapped by extremism before the point of no return. The memory of these innocent lives acts as a guiding principle, a standard against which we can measure our own commitment to justice and human dignity. It serves as a reminder that the failure at Waco was, at its heart, a failure to protect, a catastrophic breakdown in the fundamental duty of the state to ensure the safety and well-being of all its citizens, regardless of their beliefs or their social standing. As we conclude this reflection, we are reminded of the inherent, fragile nature of our democracy. It is a system that relies on trust, on the legitimacy of institutions, and on the willingness of its citizens to participate in a shared, evidence-based reality. The tragedy at Waco stands as a dark reminder of what happens when that trust is broken, when those institutions become isolated or reactive, and when the consensus on reality fractures into competing, irreconcilable visions. The task for the future is to heal these fractures, to rebuild the trust that was so thoroughly shattered, and to cultivate a society that is resilient enough to handle the challenges of extremism without resorting to the destructive and ultimately counterproductive application of absolute force. It is a monumental task, but it is one that we are all, in our own way, responsible for undertaking. The story of the Branch Davidians and the federal response at Mount Carmel is a testament to the immense, complicated power of belief and the often tragic consequences of its collision with reality. It is a narrative that resists simple closure, existing in a permanent state of tension between the desire for justice and the reality of the loss. By continuing to tell this story, by interrogating its details, and by honoring the memory of those who died, we are engaging in a necessary, ongoing, and vital process of reflection. We are acknowledging that the weight of the past is never fully behind us, and that our ability to navigate the challenges of the future is deeply influenced by our willingness to confront the lessons of the tragedies that have shaped who we are today. The truth of the tragedy continues to shape the conscience of a nation, serving as a solemn, essential reminder that the path to peace is found not in the victory of one force over another, but in the difficult, constant effort to understand, to listen, and to value every life before it is too late. Ultimately, the Waco siege is a human tragedy, one that demands that we be better, kinder, and more profoundly aware of the profound impact of our choices. It is a story that should humble us, frighten us, and inspire us to build a world where such a collision is no longer a possibility. The ashes may have long since been cleared from the plains of Texas, but the reality of what occurred there remains, etched into the conscience of a nation, serving as a solemn, essential reminder that the price of our mistakes is measured in the lives of the innocent, and that our only true protection against a recurrence is the constant, rigorous pursuit of empathy, understanding, and the truth. The journey through this history is long, winding, and deeply painful, but it is a necessary journey for anyone seeking to understand the complexities of our shared societal existence. The legacy of the tragedy will continue to evolve, reflecting the values and the anxieties of each new generation that encounters it. It will remain a source of profound debate, a catalyst for institutional change, and a constant, sobering point of reference for all those who work in the service of the law and the protection of the public. The individuals involved, the decisions made, and the devastation that followed will be remembered not just as a historical event, but as a defining human narrative that speaks to the core of our moral and societal challenges. It is a story that belongs to us all, a story that we are all responsible for understanding, and a story that will continue to remind us of the fragile, precious nature of the lives that are entrusted to our care. In the final, enduring, and haunting silence that surrounds the memory of Waco, we find the impetus to do better, to listen more closely, and to cherish the connections that bind us together, lest we ever again descend into the catastrophic, devastating chaos that defines that tragic spring in the heart of Texas. The search for meaning in the aftermath of such profound loss is an ongoing, vital, and universal human endeavor, one that unites us in our common commitment to prevent the shadows of the past from darkening the promise of the future. The tragedy at Waco, with all its complexities, its failures, and its enduring, painful resonance, remains a foundational chapter in our history, demanding that we never look away, never forget, and never stop questioning the nature of the power we hold and the lives we are charged to protect. As we move forward, may we carry the weight of these lessons with us, using the memory of the past as a guide to the light, ensuring that the spirit of every individual lost in the fire continues to shape our commitment to justice, empathy, and the enduring, fundamental value of human life in all its forms. The story of Waco is a human document of immense, tragic significance, a narrative that deserves to be remembered for the complexity of its participants and the enduring, painful lessons it offers to the future of a society that, while divided, is fundamentally interconnected, forever bound by the shared, haunting memory of a tragedy that need never have happened and must never be allowed to occur again. This is our duty, our burden, and our promise to the future. The culmination of this profound investigation into the Waco tragedy leads us inevitably back to the fundamental questions of human agency and the responsibility of the state, serving as a final meditation on the lessons we must carry forward. Over the course of our extensive exploration, we have traversed the landscape of one of the most agonizing chapters in American history, peeling back the layers of deception, ideological fervor, and tactical failure that defined the 51-day standoff. We have looked into the eyes of the victims, the innocent children, the disillusioned seekers, and the true believers, and we have questioned the systems of authority that were meant to protect them, but instead became instruments of their destruction. This process of reflection is not merely a historical exercise. It is an essential act of civic maintenance, a way to ensure that the echoes of that fateful Texas spring continue to inform our collective conscience and guide our commitment to a more humane and understanding society. What we have uncovered in this exhaustive analysis is the terrifying potential for reality to fracture when absolute, unchecked belief meets the immovable force of institutional power. The story of the Branch Davidians was not just a story of a cult. It was a story of how individuals, seeking meaning and connection in a world they perceived as hostile, were systematically led down a path of isolation that made their ultimate destruction nearly unavoidable. The role of David Koresh as a charismatic, manipulative architect of this tragedy cannot be overstated, yet our focus has remained firmly on the humanity of those he held captive, the families who were torn apart by his doctrine, the parents who were forced to choose between their loyalty to their faith and the safety of their children, and the children themselves, who had no choice but to inhabit the dangerous reality created for them. This focus on the human cost is the most crucial takeaway from our investigation, reminding us that no ideological argument can ever justify the loss of life, particularly the lives of the most vulnerable among us. The tactical and strategic failures of the federal government, while often analyzed through the lens of policy and procedure, represent a deeper, more troubling failure of empathy and understanding. The authorities were, as we have seen, caught in a cycle of their own making, where the information they gathered and the tactical responses they developed only served to confirm their preconceived notions of the threat they were facing. They viewed the Mount Carmel compound not as a community of misguided individuals, but as an enemy encampment that needed to be dismantled, and this fundamental dehumanization blinded them to the reality that their actions were only accelerating the very outcome they were tasked with preventing. This is perhaps the most enduring lesson of Waco, that the use of force, when divorced from a deep, granular understanding of the human dynamics at play, is not just ineffective, but actively harmful. It is a lesson that modern law enforcement continues to learn as they refine their crisis management strategies to prioritize communication and nonviolent de-escalation over the blunt instruments of tactical intervention. Looking beyond the immediate event, we must recognize the wider societal implications that continue to define the legacy of Waco. The distrust of government, the rise of anti-establishment sentiment, and the deepening of ideological divisions in America are all, in many ways, rooted in the trauma of this tragedy. It served as a catalyst for a national conversation that we are still having today, a conversation about the limits of state power, the protection of individual liberties, and the necessity of transparency in the workings of our government. By continuing to hold our institutions accountable, by demanding that they act with the highest degree of moral and ethical integrity, and by fostering a public culture that values dialogue over division, we are actively working to build a society where such a catastrophe is fundamentally incompatible with our core values. This is the work of every generation, and it is a work that is never fully completed. The memory of the 25 children lost in the blaze continues to be the moral compass of this investigation. Their existence in the compound and their tragic end should haunt our policymaking, our judicial proceedings, and our national discourse on the protection of children in all environments, whether those environments are religious, secular, or ideological. We must be able to create systems of intervention that can reach into the most isolated corners of our society to offer support, protection, and a pathway to safety for those who are being subjected to systemic harm. This is a profound and often daunting challenge, but it is one that we cannot afford to shrink from. The children of Mount Carmel deserve no less than our absolute, unwavering commitment to ensuring that their deaths were not in vain, and that their legacy is one of increased protection and improved understanding. As we bring this multi-part narrative to a close, we are struck by the realization that the story of Waco is, at its core, a story about us. It is about the way we view power, the way we engage with those who are different from us, and the way we handle the immense responsibility of living in a democratic society. It is a story that requires us to be humble, to be vigilant, and to be deeply and profoundly aware of the fragility of the peace we work so hard to maintain. The tragedy was not an accident. It was a consequence of human decisions, of structural weaknesses, and of a systemic inability to bridge the divide between two worlds that, while occupying the same physical space, were entirely separated by the walls of belief and institutional intransigence. Our task now is to ensure that those walls never again become barriers to the recognition of our shared, common humanity. The lessons we have drawn from our investigation are not just for the government or for the experts. They're for every person who values the sanctity of life and the importance of a just society. We must learn to challenge the narratives that seek to dehumanize others, to look past the labels of extremism, and to find the human beings behind them, and to advocate for a state that operates with the transparency, the accountability, and the empathy that we all deserve. We must never forget the silence that followed the fire in Texas, nor should we ever allow that silence to become a barrier to the truth. We owe it to the victims, we owe it to the survivors, and we owe it to ourselves to remain forever engaged in the difficult, essential work of understanding what happened, why it happened, and how we can ensure that such a calamity is never repeated. In the final, enduring reflection on this tragedy, we find that the true meaning of Waco lies in our collective commitment to a future where the lessons of the past are not just remembered, but lived. We are a nation shaped by our triumphs, but we are perhaps even more deeply shaped by our tragedies, for it is in the face of such profound loss that we are forced to reevaluate who we are and what we stand for. The memory of the Branch Davidian siege will remain a permanent, essential part of our history, a constant reminder of the price of our mistakes and the potential for our growth. It is a story that challenges us to be better, to be wiser, and to be more profoundly compassionate in all our dealings, ensuring that the light of truth continues to guide us as we navigate the complex, often dark, landscape of our shared human experience. The journey we have taken through the history of this tragedy has been a solemn, necessary pilgrimage. It has required us to hold the weight of the past in our hands, to look into the depths of a darkness that we would rather avoid, and to emerge with a renewed commitment to the principles of empathy, justice, and the fundamental value of every single life. As we step forward into the future, we do so with the knowledge that our vigilance, our compassion, and our understanding are the only things standing between us and the repeat of such a disaster. The story of Waco is our story, and its conclusion is entirely in our hands, a story that will continue to resonate through the generations, serving as a solemn, essential reminder of the profound, and often heavy, responsibility we hold for the protection and the sanctity of our shared human future. We hold the memory of the fallen in our hearts. We hold the lessons of the past in our minds, and we move forward into the future with a deep and lasting commitment to the truth for ourselves and for all those who will come after us.